A new girl at school is targeted by a bully, but he doesn't know who he's messing with. It all starts out as just normal bullying, but ends in an unexpected coup. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Maya Chan sat in the back seat of her mother's car, staring out the window as the cityscape blurred past her. Another move, another new school, another set of faces that would glance at her with either indifference, curiosity, or hostility. She had lost count of how many times she had been through this routine. It was always the same. The unfamiliar roads, the slightly different layout of houses, the same tired feeling of being uprooted and placed into yet another environment where she was expected to start over. Her mother, Sophia, sat in the driver's seat, focused on the road, her hands gripping the wheel with the quiet strength of someone who had done this too many times before. She was a woman of discipline, a woman who had learned long ago that change was the only constant. She wanted Maya to be strong, independent, careful, but Maya knew that beneath that exterior was a mother who worried. "You know the rules," Sophia finally said after minutes of silence. Maya sighed, already knowing what was coming. "Stay out of trouble. Keep my head down. Don't get involved." Her mother nodded. "Good." She glanced at Maya through the rearview mirror, her sharp eyes scanning her daughter's face. "This is the last time we move, Maya. I don't want you getting into fights again." "I didn't start the last one," Maya muttered, crossing her arms. "You finished it, though," Sophia countered. Maya didn't respond. She knew arguing was pointless. The truth was, trouble seemed to find her no matter how much she tried to avoid it. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Always quiet, always distant, never quite fitting in. Or maybe it was because deep down, she had never learned to let things slide the way other people did. Her father had always told her that real strength wasn't in fighting, but in knowing when to walk away. It was a lesson she had struggled with, because the world didn't always let you walk away. The car pulled up in front of the house, a modest two-story home in a quiet neighborhood. It looked just like every other house they had lived in before. Neat, impersonal, temporary. Maya stepped out, stretching her legs, breathing in the warm afternoon air. It smelled different here. Not bad, just different. That evening, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. Tomorrow, she would walk into a new school, surrounded by new people who would judge her before she even said a word. She had done this before, and she would do it again. The next morning, Maya walked into Clearview High School, gripping the straps of her backpack as she stepped through the front entrance. The school was big, bigger than her last one. The hallways stretched long and wide, filled with students who moved in groups, laughing, talking, going about their routines like they had been doing this forever. Maya was an outsider. She felt it immediately. She kept her head down as she walked toward the main office, ignoring the glances sent her way. Some were curious, others dismissive. New students were nothing special. But Maya wasn't just any new student, and she knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. The woman at the front desk handed her a schedule, her voice polite but indifferent. "Welcome to Clearview. Your homeroom is 2B, down the hall and to the left." Maya nodded, taking the paper without a word. She had no intention of making friends, no intention of standing out. She had one goal: stay invisible. She found her locker easily. As she spun the combination, she felt the presence of someone standing too close. She turned slightly and saw a group of students leaning against the lockers nearby. They weren't paying attention to her, not yet, but she recognized the type immediately. The leader of the group was a tall, broad-shouldered guy with the kind of effortless confidence that came with knowing he was at the top of the food chain. He leaned against the metal, arms crossed, a smirk on his lips as he talked to his friends. Even from a distance, Maya could tell he had an aura of control, the kind that made people either follow him or fear him. Brian Carter. She didn't need to ask to know his name. Every school had one. The untouchable golden boy, the self-proclaimed king of the hallways. She saw the way the students around him laughed a little too hard, the way some of them shifted their weight uneasily when he spoke. She knew his type. She had met guys like him before. They thrived on power, on intimidation. She turned back to her locker, hoping to finish quickly and move on. But fate had other ideas. As she closed the metal door, someone bumped into her shoulder. Hard. It wasn't an accident. Her books tumbled to the ground, scattering across the hallway. Laughter. She bent down quickly, ignoring the burning heat creeping up her neck. She had played this game before. Well, what do we have here? The voice was smooth, amused, with an edge of arrogance. She didn't have to look up to know who it belonged to. Brian Carter. His friends chuckled behind him, watching, waiting for a reaction. Maya took a slow breath. She had a choice: engage or walk away. She grabbed her books, stood up, and brushed past him without a word. "Hey," Brian called out, his voice carrying easily through the hallway. "Where's your manners? I asked you a question." Maya kept walking. She had dealt with people like him before. The best way to handle them was to not give them what they wanted. But Brian didn't like being ignored. She felt it before she saw it. A sharp tug on her backpack, just enough to pull her back slightly. Not enough to hurt, just enough to let her know that he wasn't letting this go. She stopped. Slowly, she turned. For a moment, the hallway felt silent. Even the students who hadn't been paying attention before had started watching. She met Brian's gaze. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity. Maybe even a little surprise. Maya spoke quietly, her voice even. "You shouldn't have done that." Brian raised an eyebrow, then laughed, a slow, mocking laugh. "And why's that?" Maya didn't answer. She just looked at him, unflinching. Brian tilted his head, studying her. "You're kind of weird, you know that?" More laughter from his friends. Maya turned back around and walked away. She didn't have to look back to know that Brian wasn't finished with her yet, and he had no idea what kind of mistake he was about to make. Maya knew how this worked. The moment she turned her back on Brian Carter and walked away, she had set something in motion. It was the kind of moment that someone like him wouldn't forget. She hadn't flinched, she hadn't cowered, and worst of all, she hadn't played into the game he expected. That alone was enough to put her on his radar. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She went from class to class, keeping to herself, answering only when necessary. She avoided unnecessary eye contact and focused on staying unnoticed. But that was the problem. She wasn't unnoticed anymore. Every time she walked into a room, she could feel eyes flickering toward her. Students whispered, exchanged glances, and it was clear the news had already spread. By the time she made it to the cafeteria, she knew something was coming. She took her tray, scanned the room for an empty table, and found one near the edge of the cafeteria where no one else sat. She wasn't looking for friends. She just wanted space. She didn't make it far. As she stepped past one of the larger tables in the center of the room, something blocked her path. Brian Carter. He was leaning back in his chair, arms draped over the backrest, a lazy smirk playing on his lips. His friends were around him, all watching, waiting. "Hey, new girl," he said, voice casual but carrying just enough force to make sure everyone heard. Maya didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge him. She just kept walking. The smirk faded for half a second, replaced by something darker. Brian wasn't used to being ignored, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Just as she was about to pass, a foot shot out in front of her. It was subtle, quick. If she hadn't been expecting something, she might not have reacted in time. But she did. She stepped over it smoothly, kept walking as if nothing had happened, but it had happened. A few of the surrounding students chuckled under their breath. Not at her. At him. Brian didn't like that. Maya felt it before she saw it. A presence behind her. A hand closing over the strap of her backpack, yanking her backward just enough to throw her off balance. Her tray clattered to the floor, the food splattering across the tiles. The cafeteria went silent. Brian stood there, still gripping her backpack strap, his smirk back in place, though now there was something sharper behind it. "Oops," he said. Maya straightened, turning slowly. She'd been in this position before. In every school, there was always a Brian Carter, always someone who thought power was measured by how many people feared them, always someone who mistook silence for weakness. She took a breath. This was the moment. The one where she decided how this would go. Brian expected her to yell, to argue, to fight back in the way he understood. But Maya didn't do any of that. She simply looked at him, then down at the mess on the floor, then back at him. Then she smiled. Not a big smile, not a friendly one, just enough of a curve to the lips to let him know she wasn't afraid. And then, without a word, she stepped around him, walked to a different table, and sat down. It was the strangest thing she could have done. And that made it worse for him. Brian stood there for a moment, clearly thrown off by her reaction. This was supposed to be easy. He pushed and people crumbled, but she hadn't. And now, instead of being the one in control, he was the one standing in the middle of the cafeteria with all eyes on him, looking like he had just lost the upper hand. The moment passed, but it had changed something. That afternoon, as Maya walked out of school, she felt the tension in the air. The sun was still hot, making the pavement shimmer, but the heat wasn't just from the weather. She knew Brian would be waiting, and he was. He leaned against his car, arms crossed, a few of his friends lingering behind him. He wasn't smiling now. Maya sighed. She had been hoping he would let it go, but guys like Brian never let things go. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly. "Let me guess," she said, voice steady. "You want another round of this?" Brian pushed off the car, stepping forward, his jaw tightening. "You think you're funny, huh?" Maya shrugged. "Not particularly." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then, with no warning, he moved. It wasn't a full-blown attack. It was a test. A quick grab, like he was trying to startle her to see if she would flinch. She didn't. Before his fingers could close around her wrist, Maya moved, smooth, fast, instinctive, a sharp sidestep, a pivot of her weight, and suddenly his balance was off. His own momentum worked against him, and before he even realized what had happened, he was stumbling forward, catching himself at the last second before he could hit the ground. A hush fell over the group. Maya just stood there, calm, unmoved. Brian straightened slowly, his face darkening. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. Maya met his gaze evenly. "A warning," she said. Brian clenched his fists at his sides, but he didn't move. Something in her voice, in the way she had handled him so effortlessly, made him hesitate. For the first time, doubt flickered in his expression. Maya turned, walking away without another word. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She had just changed the game. Maya knew the fight wasn't over. The way Brian had looked at her before she walked away had made that clear. He wasn't used to losing, and he definitely wasn't used to feeling powerless. That moment, when he had stumbled forward, caught off guard by her reflexes, wasn't just an embarrassment for him. It was a wound to his pride, a crack in the image he had spent years cultivating. She had exposed something, even if just for a second, and people had seen it. By the next morning, the whispers had spread through the school like wildfire. In the hallways, students glanced at her with newfound curiosity, some with respect, others with skepticism. Some whispered as she passed, repeating exaggerated versions of the incident from the day before. Brian had tripped. Brian had almost fallen. The new girl had dodged him so fast he didn't even see it coming. The details changed depending on who was telling the story, but the one thing that remained the same was that she had walked away from Brian Carter without fear. Brian had stayed silent through the morning, but Maya could feel the storm brewing. It wasn't a question of if he would strike back. It was only a matter of when. She sat in her first class, absently tapping her pencil against the desk while the teacher droned on about something she wasn't paying attention to. Her mind was elsewhere, running through possibilities, calculations. Brian wasn't stupid. He was impulsive, yes, but he wasn't dumb enough to attack her in broad daylight. He had an image to maintain. He wouldn't come at her recklessly, not after what had happened. No, he would plan something. He would wait for the right moment, the right place. And if she wasn't careful, he would make sure it happened on his terms. By the time lunch rolled around, Maya had already noticed the subtle shift in energy around the school. The students who usually sat at Brian's table seemed more focused, more alert. A few of them turned their heads as she walked past, watching her movements, tracking her like predators waiting for a sign from their leader. She ignored them and went to her usual table at the far end of the cafeteria. She had just taken a seat when she heard her name. "Hey, new girl?" Maya didn't react at first. She knew who it was before she even looked up. She took a slow bite of her sandwich, then casually lifted her gaze. Brian was standing near his table, arms crossed over his chest, that smirk back in place. His friends sat behind him, grinning like they already knew what was about to happen. The cafeteria had gone quieter, students pausing their conversations to see what would unfold. Maya didn't respond. Brian's smirk widened. "Still acting like you're better than everyone?" She chewed, swallowed, and finally spoke. "I'm just eating my lunch, Carter. You should try it sometime. Might help with the temper." A few students chuckled, but Brian didn't. His jaw twitched just slightly, enough for Maya to see that she had hit a nerve. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You think this is funny?" She sighed, pushing her tray aside. "I think you're predictable." The grin flickered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "You know," he said, voice smooth, "I don't really like loose ends." Maya leaned back in her chair. "That supposed to mean something?" "It means," Brian said, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear, "that I don't let people walk around thinking they can disrespect me, and I definitely don't let them get away with it." Maya studied him, the challenge in his eyes, the unspoken dare hanging between them. He wanted this to be public. He wanted to make sure everyone knew what was coming. So be it. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not stopping you, Carter. If you've got something to say, say it." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he said, "After school. Out back." The cafeteria went still. It was the unspoken rule of every high school. You didn't call someone out unless you were ready to back it up. And you didn't challenge someone in front of the whole school unless you were absolutely sure of the outcome. Maya could see it in his eyes. He thought he had her trapped. If she said no, she would look weak. If she said yes, she would be walking into his territory on his terms. She took her time, finishing the last bite of her sandwich before speaking. "All right," she said simply, standing up. A ripple of whispers spread through the cafeteria. Brian's smirk widened, but Maya didn't give him the satisfaction of looking at him again. She just picked up her tray, dumped it, and walked away. The rest of the school day passed with a strange, buzzing energy. Everywhere she went, people were talking about it. Some students looked at her with pity, some with anticipation, some with excitement. Brian Carter had never been challenged before. He was the king of the school, the one no one dared to cross. And now, the new girl, someone who had barely been there for a week, had accepted his challenge without hesitation. Maya knew exactly what she was doing. As the final bell rang, students flooded out of their classrooms, most of them heading in one direction, the back of the school. The fight had become an event. Even the ones who pretended not to care had at least a passing interest in what was about to happen. Maya didn't rush. She moved through the crowd at her own pace, her mind focused, her breath steady. She wasn't afraid. She had been in worse situations. By the time she reached the back of the school, a sizable crowd had already gathered. Brian stood in the center of the makeshift ring, rolling his shoulders, confidence radiating off him. His friends flanked him, their expressions smug, expectant. Maya stepped forward, dropping her backpack to the side. Brian grinned. "I'll give you one last chance to walk away." She didn't blink. "I'll give you one last chance to think this through." His friends laughed, but Brian's smirk had tightened slightly. He took a step forward. "You ready?" Maya shifted her weight slightly, centering herself. "You sure you are?" And just like that, the challenge was set. The game had begun. The crowd pressed in close, a tight ring of students forming an unofficial arena behind the school. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, the heat still lingering from the day, but no one seemed to care. All eyes were locked on the two figures standing in the center. The air was thick with anticipation, with the kind of electric energy that came before something irreversible happened. Brian stood a few feet away, rolling his shoulders, stretching his neck, his confidence palpable. He had been waiting for this, planning for it ever since Maya had humiliated him in the cafeteria. He wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed this time. Maya watched him with an unreadable expression. She didn't shift her weight, didn't bounce on her toes like some fighters did before a match. She was still composed, her hands relaxed at her sides. She wasn't trying to intimidate him. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just waiting. Brian smirked. "You gonna stand there all day?" Maya didn't respond. His friends chuckled from the sidelines, egging him on. He turned slightly, flashing them a grin before refocusing on her. "All right then," he muttered under his breath. "Let's see what you got." Then he moved. It was fast, faster than she had expected. His experience on the football field showed in the way he lunged, his body all muscle and momentum. He wasn't just attacking blindly. He was calculated, aiming to close the distance between them before she could react. But she was faster. The moment his arm shot out, she stepped to the side, pivoting smoothly out of reach. His fingers barely grazed the air where she had been standing, and suddenly he was off balance, his weight shifting forward. The crowd reacted instantly, a ripple of murmurs running through the students as Brian caught himself and turned back toward her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Frustration. Confusion. He hadn't expected her to move like that. Maya remained still. He exhaled sharply. Lucky. Then he lunged again. This time he feinted to the left before going right, trying to corner her. It was a good strategy. Most people would have panicked, hesitated, but Maya wasn't most people. She stepped forward instead of back, cutting through his movement at the exact right moment. Her hands brushed against his wrist, redirecting his momentum, sending him stumbling just slightly to the side. The reaction from the crowd was louder this time. They were seeing it now, recognizing what was happening. She wasn't just dodging. She was controlling the fight without throwing a single punch. Brian's jaw tightened. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something harder, more serious. He took a step back, shaking out his hands. He was thinking, recalculating. She could see it in his posture. He had underestimated her, but he wasn't going to make that mistake again. This time, he didn't charge in. He moved slower, circling her, trying to find an opening. Maya let him. The crowd had gone quiet, watching closely. Even his friends weren't laughing anymore. They were shifting on their feet, sensing something was off. Then Brian made his move. He faked high, then dropped low, sweeping his leg out in a wide arc, trying to catch her off guard. It was a good move, a fast move. It didn't work. Maya reacted instantly, hopping just enough to avoid the sweep, then landing lightly back in place. The moment her feet touched the ground, she shifted, stepping forward, closing the gap between them. She could end it now. She could put him on the ground with a single move, but she didn't. Instead, she stopped just short of him, so close that she could see the frustration in his eyes, the beads of sweat forming at his temple. And then, just loud enough for him to hear, she said, "You're not in control anymore, are you?" It wasn't a taunt. It was a fact, and he knew it. For a split second, something flashed across his face. Not just anger, something deeper. Fear. It was only there for a moment before he masked it, before he growled under his breath and lunged again, this time more desperate, more reckless. Maya stepped aside, and this time she let him fall. His own momentum carried him forward, too fast to stop himself. He hit the ground hard, palms slamming against the pavement to catch himself, his breath coming fast and uneven. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian didn't get up right away. He stayed there for a moment, hands clenched into fists against the ground. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes burned with something dark, something bitter. Maya took a step back, giving him space. She didn't have to say anything. Everyone had seen it. She had won. Not with strength, not with aggression, with control. Brian pushed himself up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. His friends hesitated for a moment before following, their faces a mix of confusion and disappointment. The crowd stayed frozen, students exchanging glances, trying to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, the whispers started. Maya didn't wait to hear them. She picked up her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and walked in the opposite direction, her footsteps steady, her heartbeat calm. She hadn't needed to throw a single punch, and that made the victory even sweeter. The whispers hadn't stopped. By the time Maya walked into school the next morning, she could feel them trailing behind her like an echo. Conversations would pause as she passed, eyes shifting in her direction before darting away when she met them. Even those who hadn't witnessed the fight firsthand had already heard about it. Word spread fast in a place like this, twisting and growing with each retelling. The story had already changed. Some said she had knocked Brian out cold. Others claimed she had humiliated him so badly he wouldn't even show his face again. The truth was more subtle, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and the power balance had shifted. Brian was still here. She had seen him that morning, standing near the lockers with his usual group, but something was different. The easy confidence, the untouchable air he had carried before, was gone. His friends still laughed, still tried to act like nothing had changed, but there was a tension there, an unease they couldn't quite mask. And Brian himself? He didn't look at her, not once. That was how she knew she had won. Maya moved through the halls with the same quiet presence she always had, but now it was different. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that was a problem. She had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, of staying unnoticed. But now, whether she liked it or not, people had started watching her. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, and others with something closer to resentment. Not everyone liked seeing the king of the school get knocked down a few pegs. Not everyone was ready to accept that the new girl had rewritten the rules. It was only a matter of time before someone tried to push back. Her locker had been trashed. She found it between second and third period, standing in front of the mess while students hovered nearby waiting to see how she would react. The door had been kicked in hard enough to dent the metal, the contents dumped onto the floor. Across the front, in a thick black marker, were words meant to humiliate, to put her back in her place. She didn't flinch. She didn't give them what they wanted. Instead, she bent down, calmly gathering her books one by one, stacking them neatly in her arms. She could feel the weight of their stares, the anticipation thicken the air. They wanted a reaction. They wanted anger, frustration, something to feed off of. She gave them nothing. She shut her locker and walked away. That, more than anything, seemed to unnerve them. She could hear their whispers as she moved down the hall, their uncertainty growing. They didn't know what to do with someone who didn't play by their rules. And that made her dangerous. By lunchtime, the tension had only thickened. She carried her tray to her usual spot, ignoring the looks sent her way, the hushed voices that followed her. She had expected things to escalate after what had happened yesterday, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. One of Brian's friends, Ryan, was waiting for her. He was a linebacker, built like a tank, and not nearly as smooth as Brian when it came to confrontation. His style was simple: brute force, intimidation, the kind of guy who didn't think too much before acting. As Maya passed, he stuck out his foot. She felt it coming before it happened. The shift in the air, the slight movement of his leg. She could have dodged it. She didn't. She let the impact catch her, let herself stumble just enough to make it look real, her tray tilting, her drink sloshing over the side. A few students laughed, expecting her to react. She straightened, brushing herself off, and turned to look at him. Ryan grinned, expecting anger. Instead, she smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to let him know she wasn't affected. Then she turned her back on him and walked away. The laughter stopped. Because that was the thing about people like Ryan. They thrived on control. They needed the reaction. Without it, they had nothing. She sat down at her table, ignoring the way the room seemed to shift around her. They didn't know what to do with her. And that was exactly what she wanted. That night, at home, she sat at the kitchen table drumming her fingers lightly against the wood while her mother moved around the kitchen. "They trashed my locker today," Maya said finally. Sophia didn't stop chopping vegetables. "And?" Maya exhaled. "And I didn't react." Her mother nodded approvingly. "Good." Maya studied her for a moment. "You're not going to ask why?" Sophia set the knife down, turning to look at her. "I already know why." Maya hesitated. "Brian isn't done with me." "No," Sophia agreed, "but you're not done with him either." Maya considered that. She had spent most of her life trying to avoid fights, trying to keep her head down, stay unnoticed. But for the first time, she wasn't running. She was standing her ground. And it wasn't just about Brian anymore. This wasn't about a schoolyard fight. This was about control, about power, about who got to decide the rules. Brian had spent years playing the role of king. But the thing about kings was that they were only as strong as the people who believed in them. And right now, those people were starting to waver. She had seen it in their eyes today. The hesitation, the doubt. It wouldn't take much more to tip the scales. She just had to be patient. The next morning, the whispers had changed. Yesterday, people had been talking about the fight. Today, they were talking about the locker, about Ryan, about the way she had refused to give them what they wanted. Some thought it was impressive. Others thought she was just delaying the inevitable. Brian's friends were angrier now. She could see it in the way they looked at her, in the way they muttered among themselves. They didn't like that she hadn't broken yet. Brian himself was quieter. She spotted him near the lockers, standing with his usual group. They were talking, but he wasn't saying much. He was listening, watching. And when she walked past for the first time, he met her eyes. It was only for a second. But it was enough. He knew she wasn't afraid, and that, more than anything, was going to be his downfall. Maya stepped out of the school building, the warm afternoon air brushing against her skin. The day had been different. Everything had been different since the fight, since the moment Brian had looked at her and realized he had lost. Not just in a physical sense. He had lost control, lost the power he once held over the school. And now, everywhere she went, she could feel the shift. People looked at her differently, whispered about her, but they weren't mocking anymore. They were watching, some with admiration, some with caution, but all with recognition. She had changed something, and she had done it on her own. She took a deep breath, stretching her arms as she walked toward the sidewalk. She had planned to call for a ride, maybe take the long way home just to clear her head. But before she could pull out her phone, she heard the low, unmistakable growl of an engine pulling up to the curb. A sleek black SUV came to a smooth stop just ahead of her. The tinted window rolled down, and she felt her breath catch for just a second. Behind the wheel, watching her with calm, assessing eyes, was her father, Jackie Chan. She hadn't expected him today. He was always traveling, always busy. He rarely came to pick her up from school, and when he did, it usually meant something important. But she wasn't surprised that he was here now. Somehow, he always seemed to know when it mattered. For a moment, he just looked at her, his face unreadable. Then, in that familiar quiet voice, he asked, "You handled it?" Maya met his gaze and nodded. "Yeah." He tilted his head slightly. "How?" She knew what he was really asking. He wasn't asking for details. He already knew them. He wanted to know if she understood what had happened, if she understood what she had done. She exhaled slowly, then said, "I didn't fight him." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, approval but measured. "Go on," he prompted. Maya shrugged. "I let him fight himself. I let him keep pushing, making mistakes, proving to everyone that he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. And when he finally fell, I didn't have to do anything. He did it to himself." Jackie smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He nodded once, his grip on the steering wheel relaxed. "Good," he said simply. "You learned." She smirked, leaning against the car door. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, but I knew you were ready when it did." She let that sink in. He had been training her for years, not just in self-defense, but in patience, in control. And now, for the first time, she had understood the real lesson. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "They won't stop, you know. People like him. They don't like losing." Maya nodded. "I know." He let a pause stretch between them, as if waiting for her to finish the thought. Then she said, "But I don't need to fight them. They're already fighting themselves." Jackie smirked, turning the key in the ignition. "Now you sound like me." Maya rolled her eyes, but she was smiling as she pulled open the door and slid into the passenger seat. The engine hummed as they pulled away from the school, leaving the building and everything that had happened there behind. She stared out the window, watching the city blur past, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Her father didn't say much as they drove, but he didn't have to. She had won, not by being stronger, not by being faster, but by understanding the game better than anyone else. And as she leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for just a moment, she realized something else. This was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more of our videos for stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. And if this one got you thinking, share it with someone who'd love it too.